The follow-up scan arrived on the third day, and I almost didn't open it. The surgery had been clean. Textbook, by Kethvi standards, a full-depth reconstructive mapping of the human patient's facial dermis, lateral scarring from a thermal event, Category 4 severity across the left orbital ridge and jaw. I had done the procedure in 6 hours. The human had been awake for part of it, which still unsettled me, but she had asked to be, and the anesthetic conversion tables for human neurology are unreliable enough that I had agreed. She had spoken to me twice during the procedure. Once to ask how it was going, once to say she was cold. I had discharged her 31 hours post-op with a standard regenerative scaffold in place, and a follow-up scan queued for 72 hours. My notes read, prognosis favorable, expected recovery arc, 8 to 12 weeks for surface closure, 6 months for full dermal depth restoration, metic result uncertain but functional outcome strong. That is the standard language for Category 4, scarring on a species with no prior, reconstructive record at this institute. I had done what I could. I considered the case complete. Then the scan opened. I read it 3 times before I called Senior Surgeon Finvayan Orthseal. She arrived 20 minutes later, looked at the display for a long time, and said nothing. Then she called Orvath 10, our tissue architecture specialist. He came in without his coat. She told me he had not planned to be in the building that morning. He stood at the display and began cycling through the scan layers the way a person does when they are looking for the error in the data rather than accepting the data. There was no error. The regenerative scaffold I had placed was doing what scaffolds do, providing a structural lattice for new tissue to anchor against. That part was normal. What was not normal was what the tissue was doing to the scaffold. It was not anchoring against it. It was consuming it, incorporating the lattice into the repair matrix, and using the material to build laterally and at depth simultaneously. Dermal strata that should have taken 3 months to begin forming were already present. Not approximated, not roughed in. Present, layered, differentiated, with collagen architecture running in the correct directional weave for a region that had been structurally disrupted. Orvath said, "This is from 72 hours post-op." I said yes. He said, "What did you put in the scaffold count?" I told him. Standard Kethvi reconstructive matrix. Same formulation I had used 400 times. He cycled back to the surface layer and expanded the magnification. The scarring at the orbital ridge, the region with the deepest thermal penetration, the area I had been least optimistic about, was closing. Not scarring over, closing. New tissue advancing across the damaged zone in a front that showed full vascular integration and nerve pathway preservation. In 72 hours, Vayan said very quietly, "What is the expected recovery arc for this species?" I told her what I had written in my notes, 8 to 12 weeks for surface closure. She pointed at the display. That is surface closure. It was, at 72 hours. We called Mara Sorrell back in that afternoon. She came without concern, which I noted. She did not seem to believe anything unusual was happening. She suggested the repair process was not painful, or at least not more painful than she considered worth mentioning. She sat on the examination surface and let me run the live scanner across her face, while the 3 of us stood around the display, trying to look as though this were routine. The live scan was worse than the archived one. In the 6 hours since the follow-up scan had processed, tissue had advanced again. The dermal depth restoration I had projected at 6 months was already at. By the tissue architecture markers we use, the closest analog I could apply, approximately 40% completion, not 40% of what I had hoped for, 40% of full structural restoration, in 78 hours post-op. Orvath sat down. He did not usually sit during examinations. I asked Mara Sorrell if she was experiencing any discomfort. She considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. She said there was warmth, sometimes around the orbital region. Not pain, warmth like the area was working, she said. And then she paused and said she knew that probably sounded strange. I told her it did not sound strange. Vayan asked her whether the healing had felt different from other injuries she had experienced in her life. Mara Sorrell thought about this for a longer time. She said that once when she was young, she had broken a metacarpal bone in her left hand. She held it up, demonstrating, and she had not known it was broken for 2 days because it had hurt enough to seek treatment. She said that when they scanned it at the medical facility on her station, the attending physician had told her it was already knitting. That it had been, she said with a small shrug, well on its way. Vayan looked at me. I looked at the scan. We let Mara Sorel go home. I told her to come back in 5 days. She thanked me and said she felt better than she had in 3 years. And then she left, and the three of us stood in the tissue mapping bay for a while without speaking. What Orvith said, eventually, was this: the Kethvi regenerative model, the model this institute was built on, the model every reconstructive procedure we perform is calibrated against, is a resource allocation model. The body identifies damage. It dispatches repair resources. It restores function in order of structural priority, surface to depth, fidelity proportional to available resources. Scarring is the evidence of the trade. The body chose speed over precision, and the scar is the record of that choice. It is not a failure. It is a biological economic decision, the same decision every species we have ever worked on makes, he said. The human tissue is not making that decision. It is not choosing between speed and fidelity. It is not trading precision for pace. It is doing both simultaneously, at a rate that our model has no ceiling for, because we have never needed a ceiling for this. The scaffold I placed gave it material. The human's own biology is providing everything else. And what it is providing, at a depth and pace that should be metabolically impossible, is not approximate repair. It is reconstruction, with the original structure as the target, not a compromise approximation of it. Orvith said, it is as if the tissue remembers what it was supposed to be, and it will not stop until it gets there. I filed the case report that night. The classification field I was required to use did not have a category for what I was describing. So I created a notation in the supplemental field: accelerated high-fidelity dermal reconstruction. Mechanism unknown, resource constraint not observed. I noted that further study was indicated, and that the Institute should consider whether the standard recovery projections applied to human patients required revision. I did not write what I was actually thinking. That would not have been appropriate for a case report. What I was actually thinking was that I had spent 22 years doing reconstructive work. I knew what damage costs. I knew what repair costs. Every species I had ever treated wore their healing in the result. The slight asymmetry, the slightly different texture, the faint flatness where the tissue had rebuilt with good materials but not quite the original blueprint. Repair is loss. That is what my training taught me. You minimize the loss, but the loss is always there. 5-day follow-up scans showed 91% structural restoration. Mara Sorel sat in the examination bay and told me her face felt like her face again. She said it the way someone says something simple, not remarkable. She asked when she could return to work. I told her she could return whenever she wished. I made my voice professional. I did not tell her what the scan showed. I did not know how to explain to a human that the thing her body had just done was not possible, because I was not certain she would understand why I thought that mattered, and I was not certain she would be surprised. I closed the file, created a new research notation. I sat for a while looking at the final scan. 22 years. I know what damage costs. I am no longer certain I know what humans pay.